Hello, everyone. Today is September 14th, 2022. I'm here today with Daniel Wellen. Daniel is a researcher and editor. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Daniel.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So we met at UCSD, UC San Diego, but you're not from America. Where are you from?
So technically, I'm half Dutch, half Spanish, but I grew up most of my life in the Netherlands, in The Hague. So that's where I consider myself to be mostly from. I lived there between the ages of 4 and 18.
What the hate?
The Hague, yeah.
What part of the Netherlands is that?
It's on the west coast. It's part of like basically the very urbanized area between Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague. Um, it's the it's the unofficial capital of the Netherlands. So Amsterdam's the capital, but it's one of the few countries where the capital doesn't house the government. So The Hague is actually where the government's at. So you have all the embassies, the government, all the institutions are in that city. Um, and it's basically part of like in the Netherlands, you have this small area of cities that can make up 60-70% of people. It's about 30 minutes between each city. So it's kind of like in that area.
Wow. How was growing up in the Netherlands?
Um, I mean, it's all I know, obviously, but it was very nice. It was very safe. You bike everywhere, so you get from very young age, you get a lot of independence and freedom, which I definitely have seen in some other countries a little bit more limited. In the US, right, you have to drive everywhere, so you're much more reliant on your parents until you're able to drive. And even then, obviously, driving is more dangerous than just grabbing a bike for 5 minutes. So it was very freeing, very independent. Um, the weather kind of sucked, but it was a great country. I really, in some ways, I miss it. It was very nice, especially to grow up there.
Very nice. And then at what age did you leave?
18.
And where did you go at 18?
At 18, I took a year to travel around. So I went in the US to a couple of places, started in Boston, and then I traveled to Australia, stayed there for about three to 4 months. And then I went to Spain. Um, and then after I moved to San Diego where we met.
How was that year off?
Uh, a lot of fun. It was very good. I think I remember it was a friend of my dad who at one point advised me to go as far away as I could from the Netherlands, just kind of see the world, go as far away as you can. And so I chose the US and Australia because that's literally the furthest away I could get. Um, and it was very nice. It was very good to see, to be shocked a little bit by like just being on your own, but in a very foreign place. And obviously, it's still very Western, so it wasn't as much as a cultural shock, but it was just good to just suddenly be very alone. And yeah, you learn that everyone everywhere is kind of the same. You make friends very easily because you have to. It's very good to kind of be forced out of your comfort zone when you're that young, because it's very easy to kind of just go to a place that or get stuck in a certain place. It's good to kind of like just go out and about for a while. So that was very good.
18 is very young for those experiences. And were you alone for all of them?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, of course, you meet friends, and at one point with some friends.
Yes.
There was this friend I met in Boston that at one point also came to Australia, and then actually we lived together again in Madrid later in life, and he's still to today one of my closest friends. But for the rest, like yeah, I traveled alone, like did everything on my own.
Wow. It is a lot of people are scared to do something like that at that young of an age, 18. Were you ever nervous, or was it pretty much you were pretty excited about it the whole time?
Um, I was definitely, I was very excited about it. I was always just kind of like I wanted to leave the Netherlands, just kind of like travel around. Of course, you're a little nervous the day before, 2 days before, but I think those hurdles to go through of like, oh, am I going to make any friends, or am I going to like where I'm going to be, and so of course you always have a little bit of that anxiety just a couple of days before leaving, but for the rest, I was just very exciting. And the moment you get there, just you forget everything. You just go with the flow, right? It's very, if you have an open mind, just kind of like just live life without thinking about it too much. And I was also lucky, right? Like nothing bad happened to me. I was pretty like, I had some like unpleasant experiences, but most of the time, like I met friends very fast. Like, you know, so it wasn't too difficult. So yeah, mostly exciting.
Yes. And so how was us you spent, you know, after this 1 year, then you went to UCSD and spent a whole year in San Diego.
Yes.
How was how does Australia, what city you were in? Sydney, correct?
Yes.
How does Australia compare to the USA, at least for you?
For me, I mean, it was a wildly different experience because obviously, um, I became very limited in San Diego because it's just a very you have to drive everywhere. You know, it was San Diego is, when it comes to cities, it's also a little bit more spread out. So it's amazing for so many reasons. But for me coming there without, you know, I back at that time I didn't have a driver's license, like so I couldn't really like move around as much. And then I was under 21, whereas in Australia, you know, I was able to just go out to bars with friends. So I just kind of switched to a very much more limited way of life, and that was definitely very hard to get used to, especially also coming from the Netherlands and, you know, in Australia. I would say people are more similar, especially from my perspective, right? They're Anglo-Saxon, they're English speaking, more or less. You have similar type of behavior and how people interact with each other. They're very open, both Americans and Australians, extremely open, extremely kind. So that was very nice, but it was definitely like I had to get used to like a different way of living, that I couldn't just go out and about, do what I wanted. And then especially also with, you know, nightlife or having, you know, my social life just suddenly had to be very different than I was used to.
Wow. And that's interesting that you say that, because it also kind of goes back to what you said about growing up in the Netherlands and being able to, you know, bike from a very young age. And that puts a lot of maturity into you, just, you know, taking that single bit of autonomy to say, I can go from here to the market to, you know, where to school, and just by myself with the bike. It's pretty safe. Um,
Yeah.
and some will go.
No, I said, yeah, for sure. That's yeah.
And something that I noticed, you know, the year that we met, there were a lot of Europeans. We met through our fraternity, and we met a lot of Europeans. But, you know, Europeans are given a lot more autonomy than I feel the millennials and possibly Gen Z. I don't really know, but, you know, have you heard of John Holst and his book, The Coddle Generation?
I haven't heard of him, but I'm sure, like I've read Jonathan Haidt. It's kind of a similar
It
argument.
might be him.
Yeah.
I think it's actually him.
Oh, okay.
That the you know, the coddle generation, like there's a severe disability by not allowing autonomy for young people. And, you know, I feel like in America there's a lot of infrastructure that makes it difficult for young people to take autonomy of themselves, such as the simple example, they need a car to drive from point A to point B. And for a lot of 16-year-olds, 16-year-olds aren't very responsible. So, you know, they have a much higher accident rate, crash rate at that age than, say, an 18-year-old. And just not having the infrastructure in place to allow them to do these small things by themselves, you know.
Yeah.
It
Yeah, no, it's
it
it's
go.
really hurting or hurtful towards like when you're a kid, like you're supposed to just, you know, be able to go out every now and then. And I think that's also argument of someone like Hyde, that as a kid, it's the same thing with when you see young animals, and same with young humans, is that they look for the limits every time, right? And the moment you find a new limit, you explore, you get used to it, you find a new limit, and then you kind of like that, you move on, you mature, you learn to know the world. But at one point, yeah, you get used to your house and your family and your neighborhood pretty quick. You don't need to wait until you're 16 or 18 to kind of get suddenly exposure to more. And that is very difficult for younger kids if you just protect them too much to anything outside, or if you always have to take care of them, right? You have to drive them somewhere. That's essentially you solving their issue for it, right? I remember in the Netherlands when I was something like 15, one of my friends was in a band and they played in this little like cafe / bar on a Friday night. And I think I was 16. And me and my friends just had to figure out how to get there. It was in the center of The Hague. And of course, like that was still, considered a big city. I still lived a little bit outside of it. But we just took public transportation, on our own. We just had to figure it out. You have to Google, you have to start solving problems yourself. And I think just that whole process of, either biking or just going out and about, having to deal, when I grew up, 16 was the drinking age in the Netherlands. It was until 15% alcohol. So beer, wine, you could have from 16 already, and then hard liquor would be 18. And by now they changed that, which I think is good. But when I grew up also with 16, you could be in a bar. So you also just see, it's not like you have to wait till 21 to see, some of the ugliness too of how people are, of what, happens in society, that you're exposed to it from a younger age. And still within, you don't immediately go clubbing when you're 16, but just in your local neighborhood bar, you might go, you play some cards with your friends. You might have one beer on a Friday night, and then slowly you're kind of eased into this life that exists outside of you. You start getting exposure, and it's very, not dangerous, that's the word I keep going to, but more it can be very limiting to young kids if you don't allow them to have that experience until they're 18, let alone 21. And I think we've both seen a lot of people who are very sheltered until they go to college, and then it can go very wrong because
Yes.
they don't know how to handle themselves. They don't know how to behave in such social environments, or and then sometimes you can underestimate dangers of it, or you can overestimate, some certain things. But yeah, I think there's definitely an argument to be made there to allow your kids a little bit more freedom and to push them to do so.
Absolutely. And it makes life easier for them at the end of the day. Like you said, limits, finding that limit, applying that limit. Most of us are we're not going to do something, that's always in our mind. We don't want to push the limit too far and then do something where we can't retract backwards. But being continuously told that that limit is dangerous, don't push that limit, if you do that, you're going to, it's going to be all wrong, when it's maybe, there's a huge, maybe it's true at times. Like maybe if you do push that limit, there will be a few people that do surpass what was intended. But if you put that out as a whole framework for an entire generation, there's going to be a lot of people who don't try, who don't take a leap, who don't go past their comfort zone because they're being told it's dangerous, it's you could just stay here, be comfortable, it's safe. Well, eventually things are presented to us which aren't so safe, and we don't know how to handle those, because as much as we want to stay in this comfort zone, it doesn't, it's sort of a fabrication. It can be there, but it can't last forever.
Yeah. No, I think what you're saying like nails it with, there's two things there. One is that it's stagnant, right? You don't get new experiences, you don't get exposure, you don't learn, right? That's how you learn, at trial and error. Like do something, hit your head against it, and then you learn. And then two as well is like, it doesn't prepare you. It makes you more fragile, right? It makes you more vulnerable to, if you don't know how to deal with that and something actually does come, which will guarantee in your life, there will be things, then you won't know how to do it on your own level, or on your personal level. And I think you see that as well in like how we now relate to one another, or relate to something like the state, or something like the church for some people, is that if you've been protected your entire life, you're going to look for entities to protect you. And so we've seen also that we've seen a huge increase of people just abdicating responsibility towards something like the state, that if they don't like something, or if they run into really difficult things in their neighborhoods, or in their country even, then they don't know how to deal with that. They don't know how to deal with confrontation, with difficult things, with moments where it's not controlled, outside of your control, where the solution or the answer is not clear, where there are many paths to take and you have to make a decision. And then they just, their entire life they've been protected, they're just trying, okay, someone else figure it out. Like a state should come in and do this, or make it safe, or make it better, instead of like knowing how to deal with it from just an individual, or with a family level, or a community level. And I share your concern of like, if that happens on an entire generation, although I think that's also maybe a little bit overblown, but that could potentially lead to very outcomes that we don't even think about, right? In politics, or in worse situations that could have difficult outcomes. Yeah.
What types of outcomes could you see come from that?
Well, one thing is, like I said, that people are just putting responsibility onto something like a state, or something like a market, or whatever you're interested in that sense. But basically, like, that it's not up to you to deal with. It's not something that should be decided on a local level, on your level. And of course, these trends are not just because we didn't give our kids independence, but it's part of just the entire culture that we currently have. It's that idea that instead of fixing it in the here and now, instead of just dealing with it, instead of just exploring different alternatives, or like discussing things, or seeking limits, just deliberating on different outcomes, we see this push towards someone else to deal with it. And that's why we've seen unprecedented increases in state, right? As in entire Western world, states have grown tremendously, even during administrations from like Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump that said, they were good kind of cuts. They've actually increased tremendously, because they are like, people look at them to like take care of something, right? If something goes wrong, like take the financial crisis, right? I mean, this is a very complex issue, but one of the first reactions was that the government should step in and immediately regulate everything. And it's just that default, that whenever something goes wrong, something could come in and basically make more rules and try to control it more. And that is really kind of just goes hand in hand with this whole thing that we've been discussing, that also this inability to deal with uncertainty, that you don't know how to deal with an uncertain world where things will go wrong, things will be different, where there's not a clear, you cannot just follow the rules, and then that's not life. There's no, like there'll be moments that you're going to face decisions that have many more potential options, and they're all equally good and equally bad, right? There's not just going to be one good decision or answer and one wrong. And if we don't learn from young age as well to deal with that, an uncertain world, and just decide to like try to control it by throwing on government rules, or throwing on like other kinds of control mechanisms, and that could be disastrous. And you see it a lot, that people cannot, like also with the political correctness, the woke movement, stuff like that. I think that stems from a deep thing that people cannot deal with conflict, that people haven't learned that, like, hey, you disagree with something I say, okay, let's just talk about it. We don't need to immediately like, I don't need to be right for you to be wrong. We can also just be equally right, but from different perspectives. Or even, it is completely possible to have two equally valid but completely contradicting views. It doesn't mean that one is true, one isn't true. But this whole kind of mentality we had, and it could very well spring already of how we're teaching and raising our kids, to not even want to engage in that world out there, to not want to just figure something out, to not want to kind of like problem solve with people and encounter difficulties and challenges that sometimes you fail, sometimes you're not going to know, sometimes you're going to be wrong. And instead we're trying to control it, that we're never wrong or that we never even need to try. And that, I think, is a very safe, it's very comfortable to not have your assumptions being challenged, but it's extremely dangerous because
Yes.
those assumptions come from somewhere. So basically you're leaving that power of whoever do make those assumptions or institutionalize assumptions. You can just give them free rein if you don't want to engage in it. And that, I think, is like, yeah, okay. That's one of the things I see.
Absolutely. I listened to a podcast recently. It was on Econ Talk. I forgot who the guest was, but the guest's argument was that democracy functions best when the populace thinks deeply. And thinking deeply is difficult. It is really, we can have our ego challenged. Like, I understand, assigning that responsibility. For example, this is a really kind of foolish example, but I like to think of, saturated fat was demonized for a long time in the USA for decades. And so a lot of people stayed away from it. And not to say that it's great, but it was literally demonized. And now there's a lot of information saying, okay, maybe it's not so great, but that would mean that people have been listening to and abiding by rules that are completely false for 30 plus years. And not to say it is true or it isn't true, but a lot of people won't even take that information in because it's very difficult. It's very difficult to put down an argument that you've held or an idea that you've held for so long. And a lot of ideas get put on us, like you said, by other people throughout our childhood. And, nothing we do is really like truly authentic. Maybe it can be to a certain degree, but it requires a lot of thought. It requires a lot of intention to say, what am I getting in? And even then, it's still a question. But not being able to accept that we're wrong or other people's beliefs and not being able to, it's really uncomfortable to be like, okay, wow, I was wrong. It's really tough to make an argument. For example, maybe make an argument on Twitter for 3-5 tweets, and then by the end of it, someone has really made a better argument than you. It's tough to even say, okay, you're right.
Yeah.
But being able to speak with people and not become not become, I don't want to say confrontational, but
Angry.
angry.
Oh, there's this really great quote from Pascal that said that all man's struggles are a result of man's inability to sit alone in a room by himself. And it's kind of like this whole idea, right? That it's really hard to think. It's really hard to just stop and just really, contemplate your own opinions and views and really think like, where do they come from? What do I even think? Most people don't, me included. There's a lot of opinions that I hold that are probably, at one time maybe heard. Maybe my parents had those opinions and I just blindly took them over. And it's good to just, we hear it a lot, like challenge yourself and be critical, but a lot of times we are not even encouraged to actually be so, because the moment you disagree with something that's not popular, like it's popular to be critical, except when you're critical. and just, I mean, something I always do that I got sometimes a little bit of backlash for is that someone once complained that I had, like, every other day I basically have a different opinion about, even if it's the same topic. My partner, it drives her crazy because I might disagree with her on a topic, next day be supporting the argument she was making. But if anything, it's kind of just like, yeah, put yourself in, just choose a side and try to argue for it or argue against it, and don't just hear something and like accept it. It's really good to just be very plastic in your thinking, in your opinions, and then you also start to see it like how they are very wobbly, right? They're not as firm as I thought they were. Yeah, it's an interesting issue that we have right now. We get angry with one another because we think, I mean, it's a little bit into a different area, but it's often because we really think that what we defend is the truth. Because if you don't just challenge yourself all the time, think it's wobbly, or even, just think about manifold argument, where we kind of said earlier that there can be equally valid, completely contradicting our positions. But we now have come to this point that we think that what our side is true and the other side is false. So now you're changing the debate. Instead of it becoming a deliberation between potential outcomes, potential positions, between different priorities or preferences, you're shifting the discussion to be something about right or wrong, about good and evil. And then, then it becomes very problematic, because then when you see this anger and this partisanship and this really like this fierce intensity, that probably shouldn't be in these conversations, but that is, because you're laying a claim to the truth. And that is very dangerous, because if you claim the truth, then you can basically do anything with it, right? Like if you claim to be the rational side, then not only are you saying, that somehow what, you know everything, because that's what you're saying. If you claim the truth and you claim to be rational, then you claim to know everything and every side. But by definition, you're saying that the other side is irrational. And I think that is very worrisome, because if you're fighting irrationality, you're not just fighting a different opinion, you're fighting stupidity in your view, right? And that is just, so you're starting treating people lesser, like you start becoming arrogant. And we see this all the time, especially in American politics, that, it's, if you voted for Donald Trump, it's not that you had different views or opinions or just, valid concerns about certain things that we should take serious. No, it means you were stupid. You didn't know what was going on. You were just not, right? The word, like, you were uneducated. And that is like the worst we can do, is just to start treating people like this, because then we start ignoring them, saying like, yeah, you're stupid, you don't matter, you should listen to us because we know what the truth is. We know, right? Like through various routes, we lay a claim on truth, on reality, and we don't care about what's your actual lived experience. Forget about that, right? It's about what our assumptions say about rationality, about truth, about reason. And if you don't fulfill that category, then you shouldn't be critical, because if you're then critical of that, you're just stupid. That's what a lot of people are arguing right now. So that's definitely a serious problem.
It is a serious problem. What do you think people can do to combat that?
I think it starts, like, you often hear things like we should be able to talk to one another and be tolerant and stuff. But it's not just about, like, sure, you should be open. You should not, you get angry, you should be open to other views. But it's not just about tolerance, because then it's very dangerous to go the complete other side. That tolerance to the max is just indifference, right? If you're just tolerant of everything, you're just indifferent, like, because there are certain things that are better than others. And we should definitely not be indifferent about certain values or certain things, and not just be tolerant to, like, if someone comes in and like, I don't know, I support, the craziest extremist positions that would be very damaging to society or to a neighborhood community, we should absolutely not be tolerant. And we should absolutely engage in a serious conversation, not just be like, agree to disagree. No, we should fight that, and we should very seriously like have conversation with that person to try to change their minds. But I think that's the whole point, is this: we should do the hard work of having those conversations. And one of the examples that I often bring up is the podcast of Joe Rogan with, I don't even know with who, but it was that people were claiming to Spotify and the government that it should be banned, right? It should be taken off because it was spreading misinformation about COVID. And also disclaimer, I've not seen that episode. I don't know the guest who was on, but just that fact that you are, instead of doing the hard work of engaging, you hear something, maybe it's wild, I don't know, maybe it was wildly, wrong, but then fight it with what you think is wildly right? Like, go do the hard work. Do the hard work of going in and debate them, right? Like, debate on solid foundation, good arguments why they are wrong, and you think they're wrong and you're right. But instead, we are doing, again, what we kind of said before, we're relinquishing this responsibility to like a state or to something like Spotify, a corporation. It's like, no, you should just ban it. Like, that's lazy. We shouldn't argue. We should just ban it, take it away. And that's kind of like, that's exactly what we shouldn't do. It's like, because we know what's true. That's not true. Ban it. That's a complete, like, you're just laying a claim on truth. You're not actually arguing for it. And I think that's definitely like what we should do. Is just like take it more serious. If you want to spread misinformation about COVID, do the hard work. Go into local communities and listen to them, listen to their concerns, and argue them. And talk to them. And don't just put posters of follow science. It's like, what the hell does that mean? Trust the science. It's like, the science? Like, really? Like, that's the best we can come up with, instead of just like going down, taking their concerns serious, like knowing that, scientific method is not, like, anyone who says the science as a collective thing is just like, what are you talking about?
It could be a religion at that point.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's this Harvard professor, I forgot his name, but he wrote this book about virtual politics in the basically Renaissance, because his book's all about how the Renaissance thinkers were a reaction to a very corrupt establishment then, especially with the church, especially religion. And they kind of want to focus on why politicians should be more virtuous. We should focus more on, right, like being honest and truthful and humble, stuff like very virtuous kind of things. And he was making this exact thing, that this argument that today we're not even thinking about virtue because we're just so concerned with scientism, right? It's this full belief in science, and that should, right, that is our claim on truth. It's just like, no, we have science on our side, right? It's the same thing. We have God on our side. We have faith. Like, we have the truth on our side. Instead of that, like, hey, it's like there's a bunch of scientific experiments, a bunch of data, like they can be interpreted, and I'm fully on I think there's a lot of data to prove that you should get vaccinated and that it's safe, and that, that's not the issue here. The issue is more that, like, do the hard work, like discuss those studies, discuss the data that might contradict that the vaccine is safe, instead of just banning that data or banning any argument against it. It's like, because in the end as well, and I think that's what we're underestimating, is it is easier to believe the truth or something that, right, like, seems to be true than not true. So if you want to fight lies, you're gonna win. If you just fight it, if you just engage in a conversation with someone, like, you're probably gonna win. They're probably gonna be convinced by you. Some people not, but that's their right. That's their individuals. They're autonomous individuals. They can choose. But don't engage in this, like, don't take responsibility away from people. Don't treat people like idiots, like they'll never understand. We're not even going to explain it to them. We're just going to ban any kind of information. I think that's kind of like an example of like this whole Spotify, Joe Rogan thing, of like how we don't even engage in the moral discussions or, the difficult conversations. We just say, like, let's not have them, just trust us. I don't think that's right.
I don't think it's right either. And I think a big part of it stems from the a lot of people don't want to be uncomfortable. They want us to have reached the end of history.
Mhm.
World War II was the war of all wars, and since then we have science developed on every frontier. We even have science of emotions with psychology and psychiatry. So we don't even need to be, very you know, emotional about our emotions. There's a document, you've got it's defined
Uh,
within a whole form of science. And so it's all it's all done, and now we can all just it's it's not true. We're still to some degree, it's become very obvious too with the younger generation. There's a huge change in just the way that people are behaving. It's maybe it's not inconsistent with previous times, like, with the change from agrarian to, I'm sorry, from, being non-agrarian to agrarian, or from being agrarian to manufacturing based. And maybe something in this becoming, more and more dependent on even screens. You and I are communicating through a screen. And so we're all finding difficulty integrating these new features into our lives. And, it's not just X plus Y is equal to Z with these pieces. There's no structure to say, if you do this and this and this, if you eat these things, if you exercise, if you sleep this amount, if you blah, 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 then you're good. It's all documented right here. And it's it's not easy to just realize, okay, I'm here now. Um, you know, I've got some things going on in my life, not sure what's going to happen with them. You know, you have some it's not easy being in a place of discomfort, and we're being continuously told that that's not correct. And to some degree, maybe it isn't. Maybe, we do need to have some sort of grounding foundation, even in our thought patterns, because if we don't, then we can be all over the place too. But still, not being able to take in these new things, to be able to understand that human beings are human beings, and that I last time we spoke, you brought something up that was really interesting. I hadn't really thought about it, but this idea of rationality, it
about
it's not
rationalism, or
rationalism. Could you speak about that?
yeah, absolutely. I just because I want to respond already to what you said, that it's exactly what I've been trying to research over the last couple of months to year, um, and across time in different time periods has happened as well. But it's this belief in rationalism, and it's this belief that there are these universal underlying laws of history or of nature, right? And that if we can uncover them and explicate them, we can understand what's happening. And not only that, we can understand what will happen. And it's exactly kind of what you said, right? It's this almost this formula. If we can uncover the parts of the formula, we will understand reality. We will understand history. We will understand nature. And there's been different movements across from this. And that is essentially what rationalism is. That our job is not to debate about what our priorities are with our communities, what we think is good or not good, what we want in life, and just set goals towards that. What we should do is apply reason or rationality or science to uncover these truths that are universally applicable, are general, and will always apply everywhere. And that is a dangerous ideology. It's what's behind the French Revolution. It's about Rousseau. It's about Hegel. It's about what's behind Marx with his philosophy of history. That there was just these underlying Hegelian laws of nature. It led to a lot of mistakes across history, and it all kind of relies on this idea that there is this Nietzsche was Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher. He was the first one that kind of like really identified this, is that across philosophy and Western thought, there has always been this idea of a dominant world, like a true reality, like what's true, and a contingent world. And our world, which we live in, which we see, which we touch, it's all just a contingent world. And this really started with Plato, going to Nietzsche, and there's some good literature on that as well. That, right, Plato argued with ideal forms. There's this world of ideal forms, that everything has an ideal form, and everything that we see is not the ideal form itself, but basically the reflection of it, or that thing becoming the ideal form. And it's kind of like highlighted in this very famous thought experience of the cave. So that we're in a cave and we see shadows on the wall, and that's our world, right? What we see. But the shadows of the wall are actually from people outside dancing around a fire, but we don't see them because we're turned around and we only see the wall with the shadows. And so basically the whole analogy is like, we shouldn't believe what we see, right? There's a true world out there which we cannot see, and which through some mechanisms we can try to understand. And that's why I'm not as critical of someone like Plato as Nietzsche is, but because Plato it's still within our possibility, you know, and we can still understand, especially on an individual level, trying to, right, like he also tried to, the cave also meant like, hey, challenge yourself to like not just take on what you see. But this kind of like, this started in Western thought, that there is this certain certainty, that there is this true something that was certain, that could explain everything, right? That would always work well with everything. After that came Christianity, which basically took it a step further, right? There's this outside world that basically controls our contingent world. However, Christianity took the step that it separated humans even possible to understand it, right? Like you go to heaven once you're dead, there's no way of you understanding that. And Enlightenment was kind of like this whole reaction to take it back. That no, we can understand the truth, we can understand this dominant world, but through reason, right? By applying reason, by applying a scientific method, we can actually uncover what this true reality is, this true world is. And that, I think, is a danger. Like, it's very good that the Enlightenment put it back towards humans, but it basically replaced the church for technocrats, or for the intelligentsia, or for the experts. That they basically came into these worlds. And there's this true world out there that you can only uncover through either, you know, isolated psychological experiments, through either, you know, scientific mathematical calculations or whatever. And we are in between. We are the interpreters, right? We are the scientists, we are the technocrats. We will tell you what is true. And Nietzsche was extremely critical of this view that there is a dominant and a contingent world. Like this world, he was much more of the view that this is the world. Sure, what we see might not be the reality behind it on a physical level or a chemical level or whatever, but it is this world, right? It's not something that is out there that we need to get to understand what's happening here. We should focus on what's happening here. We should focus on empirical evidence. We should focus on just the hard things that we see and experience and try to interpret those. And it kind of like what you said as well, that people don't want that. It's a rejection of complexity, that the world is extremely complex, that essentially, you know, these laws of history, these laws of nature, it's very nice because once we cover them, they're always applicable. There are these general laws that at one point allow us to decide everything because we know how the world works. We know what will happen. It's like this deterministic dogma that once you know the laws of history, the laws of nature, you can say exactly what's going to happen. And luckily, there's also this huge counter movement now about this complexity theory, right? The theory of everything, kind of a chaos theory, that is saying, wait a second, this idea that, you know, you can break everything down, this reductionist idea that you can break everything down into its parts, look at it, understand it, mathematically model it, and then you can understand the whole. That's just not true, right? Like the world is emergent. It's spontaneous self-organizing. So the parts or the whole is larger than the sum of its parts. And that is just something that a lot of people are not very comfortable with because it says that the world is extremely uncertain. It is not deterministic. even if we know everything that has happened yesterday, we cannot predict what will happen tomorrow, because the world tomorrow is fundamentally different from the world yesterday, because events happened. And I think it was Churchill said that history is just the one damn thing happening after the other, and that's it. That we cannot, like, sure, you can look at trends and you can learn from history, but same like with nature, it's not just this algorithm that at one point you uncover and that determines what will happen. We have agency, ideas matter, and I think that this is the discomfort with that it's difficult, right? It would be very nice if we had an algorithm that could model an AI that could just tell us what to do in every circumstance because it took into account everything. That would be great. It would be lazy, right? It's easy. It's like Spotify canceling the podcast. It's great. We don't need to think about it. We know do it. We can just focus on our stuff. But that's just not the world we live in. We need to have moral deliberation about what we want, where we want to go, about what is actually true. And that there's, I've been talking for a while, but like there's a lot of obviously aspects to this. But that's, I think, just a general idea that, this idea of rationalism, it's universal laws, that as long as we can uncover them, we can basically explain the world. But that is, I think, is deeply flawed. We need to listen to what we sometimes experience, not to what our theories say and our models say. The theory that worked for yesterday might not work tomorrow because the world has changed. Actions have influenced the world and changed it. So in that sense, like, we have to be much more careful, much more serious about how we approach this idea of rationality and reason, because, like we talked about earlier, that it's a slippery slope of thinking that you uncovered rational human behavior or something like that, and then apply it to your country, and then anyone who doesn't behave in that way is just stupid, or is worse, is irrational. They're a danger to society because they are acting irrational. And that's just not true. And that's why rationalism is very dangerous. Most people act very rational. It's just not according to our models of, utility maximizing agents that will always, try to go for economic incentives or make ourselves better off.
How do they act rationally?
In many ways. I think there's also really great literature on rationality. De Tocqueville, Max Weber wrote about like action, rationality, and just different types that sometimes a human can act completely rational if they believe in something. For example, right, like one of the things that is often criticized is that it's often said by more like democratic people in the US towards Republicans, that they vote against their own self-interest, right? That, economically they vote, or politically they vote against their own self-interest. And so it's not rational to vote that way. But some people just vote because they believe in the idea of democracy. So then suddenly you're not talking about actually making a choice between two candidates or whatever, but then suddenly the act of voting or voting for that person is just because, they believe in that, or they believe in one part of it. And that can be very rational. Or, you have other examples that sometimes we are very kind to people. We give a lot away to some people. We sacrifice a lot of our time, money, health to just help people, and we get nothing in return. Is that being irrational? Sometimes, it's just, we need to change our model of rationality. And I think there's a lot of very interesting, like, evolutionary biological research and anthropological research as well, that we evolved in a very different way. We've evolved through reciprocal altruism, by working in communities, by sharing. So in that sense, like, is it rational to share something with someone even though you don't gain anything from it? Absolutely, because it strengthens the community. Is it rational to give away a lot of your wealth if you're very wealthy? Yeah, that could very well be. Is it rational to vote for Donald Trump, even though maybe inherently that he's a complete liar, that he's, all his policies might not work, but you've been suffering for 30 years and no one has been paying attention to you? That is it then not very rational to vote for a person that says screw the system? Like, all these people are not, they don't care about you. Is it then not rational to be like, yeah, that's true? Like, we try something different. That, to me, that's extremely rational. And that's why I think if we change the model of rationality, like not to say like, they based their decision based on the policies he proposed or the economic situation that there will be at the end of his presidency, that is how rationality should be calculated. No, it's not. There's many different ways, and I would argue we don't even know most of them. So that's kind of a one point. It depends completely on one's circumstances, on one's environment, on one's community, what rationality in that moment is. And there's this philosopher, Kevin something from MIT now, that is doing exactly that. He's creating an absolute epistemology about rationality, about that in most cases, most people act very rational. And I think that's just a view worth to protect or to defend, because it takes away that idea of like, I'm right, this is true, that's false, right? You're stupid for thinking that. Like, it's maybe that's their reality. Maybe that it's true in their situation. Like, we don't know. We don't have all the circumstances, right?
That involves giving up a lot of deliberation of your own choice, of our own choices, by saying, okay, they have a certain aspect of rationality. It's not very similar to mine. Well, then what is this law of nature that I hold on to so deeply? What is this law of being, this laws of science? These are so absolute. This person right here has a completely different context of life. And if they apply the same rules that I'm applying, they are not going to be in a great position. Maybe that's not obvious to us, but understanding that it's interesting, because it's not easy, again, to look at that painting. One, it takes energy to even see the shadows on the cave moving around, and then first of all realizing, is this really all there is? Because you can just get entertained by the shadows. Those can be enough. But one thing that I fear is that a huge amount of this depression, a huge amount of this, youth having very, very different forms of thinking and not being able to take their autonomy, is them saying, okay, me watching these shadows, these are entertaining enough. Moving is kind of, it's not even, I'm comfortable here. Why should, I don't even know if I'm going to find something else, like, you don't know if those people are dancing there. You don't know if if you're going to move to a part where there are no shadows and it's just going to be pitch black. And I think a huge part of life is realizing, like, being, that optimization, complete optimization doesn't actually lead to reality optimization. Like, you can define all these metrics, you can, do all these things and be optimized by all these defined parameters, and your life at the end of the day, someone who doesn't do any of that, who just kind of lives more in accordance with how their life would be most easeful and best for themselves, they can be much more optimized just by understanding what's, just by recognizing, being more open and understanding that, like, it's not, there's not these one little things that are going to change, but it's complicated. Systems are complicated. The influences on our life are complicated. It's not like if we change one thing, our life is going to get better just like that. Maybe it's true for some things that are very obvious, but it's really, we have to be willing to engage, to put in the energy and time. Continue.
And to just acknowledge and accept this uncertainty, like David said,
Yes.
that the world is a complex system made out of many complex systems, that's okay. That now we have this narrative that no, it's scary because we want to know everything, right? We want to kind of control everything. We want to like know the circumstances and all the factors involved. But we have to also kind of just start arguing for the case that what makes life beautiful is that it's uncertain. You shouldn't know today where you'll end up, where you'll be in 5 years. That question, where do you see yourself 5 years? It's good to have an idea of like where you're working towards, right? That's just setting goals. That's scenario planning. That's great. Because what setting goals and scenario planning does is take into account the uncertain world that, hey, what if this happened? I want to kind of be here. I want to kind of just creating different alternatives. But now as well, it's this class I took when I was studying at Stanford for a little bit, that they made you create a 10-year plan of like, not just like where you see yourself in what kind of capacity, what you want to do. No, how are you going to get there? Create a map, the decisions you're going to make. And at one point it's like, that's so, what a futile effort. Like you make that in, January of 2020. Well, I'm sure that worked out for you. It's like how many things happen all the time that you have no idea. And if you create that plan and it's kind of go exactly back to what we talked about before, that once that plan falls apart, if you relied on that plan your entire life, then what on earth are you going to do? Of course you're going to get depressed. Of course you're going to get anxious about everything because you can't control anything. And that's, I think, by accepting that, no, that's actually what makes life a lot of fun. It's not fun to know already what's going to happen in 5 years. It's fun to like figure it out, to explore your limits, to continuously push and go into the world and, date people, to maybe know your future wife or husband, like not already knowing who's going to be, when you're going to meet. That's no fun. Kind of like bringing back, and it's just, I'm sure that adds to a lot of the issues that you identified with maybe younger generations, with maybe the depression numbers, the numbers of increasing suicides or self-hurting and stuff like that. At one point, it's just, how can you possibly be happy in a world that's determinist, right? Like it's not, because one, it's not true. So it's one thing if that would be true, and then okay, you have to deal with it. But it's just not true. So we are everything in our evolution clashes against that. Everything. That's why people voted for Donald Trump, because they knew that this would, we need something else. Now, I'm not saying that was the right solution, but it's at one point people will rationally deviate or make different decisions, right? People will at one point move places or just leave things or think about other alternatives, because rationally that would be the good thing to do. If whatever is there is not working for you, it's not making you happy or fulfilled, it's making you depressed, like you should change. You should absolutely change your life and do things differently. You can do that on an individual level, but you can also do that on a societal level, or mostly a community level. But yeah, that's it's. I think it's again like something with this, it's just this acceptance of uncertainty. That's okay. We should actually encourage it in people, right? We should become anti-fragile to like just let things come and test things out, and don't like create these beautiful models that have no relation to reality, because they're going to fail. And when they fail, they're going to fail 10 times as hard than if they would fail immediately.
Yes. That's a huge thing to take away from it all, is that failing fast is it's less expensive than failing slowly, because learning that lesson immediately, being able to accept the lesson immediately, being able to change your system to a new way of thinking that might be better for yourself and for the people around you, that is, because it's gonna, we recognize these things at one point, and hopefully, maybe we don't, maybe for some things we do take, we don't recognize it before we pass away. But a lot of times, I mean, we just, living in ignorance is not necessarily bliss. It's
no, you could even argue we have a duty right? And you can go as far as an evolutionary duty, but that's the whole purpose of it. Is, I think it was Karl Popper who said that, you know, we have a duty to try things as fast as we can and let them fail as fast as we can. And that kind of goes back to the whole point of engaging in these discussions to see, you know, if you're wrong. It's not like, what is it good to you if you sure, you have your opinion, no one challenges you, but it's wrong. Wouldn't you want to know more? Wouldn't you want to learn more? Wouldn't you want to end
Yes.
up in a better position, help your society progress towards a much better world and life? And what is it good to like keep in place things that don't work? You know, and of course then we get to the whole conversation of vested interest and whatever. Because for some people, small people group, it might be good in the short term, but in long term, we have a duty to try things. That's all scientific method. Try things out, see if they work, see if they're true. If they're not, immediately discard with them. If the moment we stop with this in terms of scientific method, the moment we are, you know, theorizing, falsifying, and then seeing that something is not true, and then if we spend a second more on that theory instead of like discarding that as explanation, then we're going the completely wrong way. Discard.
Yes.
And now you look in, you know, in a lot of the scientific fields, people are more busy defending their position than actually trying to falsify it, trying to test them. They're just trying to argue for why they're right, why their book was completely correct. Instead of just, you know, I admire that people can say, look back at work they maybe did 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and just say like, wow, yeah, I'm glad that those 400 pages today we learned that that wasn't entirely true. You know, that should be the case. If you write a book or you propose an argument or you create a scientific theory, you would hope that a generation from now, they would know more than what you did when you created that, right? That some things would be different because that means progress, that means evolution. But no, we want to kind of control everything. This is it. I create this theory that is applicable in every situation. And it's just, yeah.
Have you heard of the new age imposter syndrome that a lot of people, I don't know if it's older, I know I felt it at one point, but this idea that, you know, we're being placed in these positions that we're not really capable of, and people are feeling a deep sense of inadequacy. This sort of thinking that we're talking about really is able to shift the how someone views maybe something like imposter syndrome, because if we hold on to a deep sense of wanting to be comfortable, if we hold on to a deep sense of this world is defined for us, and you know, there's certain answers, those answers are there, we just need to know them, and then once we know them, everything will be easy. When we come up to new challenges in our life, that imposters, if we bring this sort of thinking, this mental framework, that imposter syndrome is right there, because we don't know these new things, and so we don't have that knowledge, and so we're in this position without that knowledge, and these things are defined here, but we're not really in a position, we can't do this, we're an imposter here in this position. And that's a real what?
But that's the point. That's the point, that right, you should be in a position that it's new and you need to figure out how to do it.
Yes. And also, you know, realizing, you know, looking back at history and realizing like most things that people did, they didn't know going into it. Like, and we're all human. Like, they had less tools than we do to do things, and they didn't know anything. Like, you know, Galileo, before looking at the stars, didn't know anything. Friedrich Nietzsche was coming up with these ideas. Maybe they were defined in other workings, but modernizing them, applying them to the day. Albert Einstein bringing in these sort of theoretical physics, creating nuclear energy, going to space. I mean, these are all things that happened within the last several hundred years. Nobody knew what was going on. And just you know, it, like you said, you mentioned it. There isn't, I mean, there can be some, there's going to be cost, there's going to be expensive to do something you think is right, and eventually you realize it's wrong. But that's not a tragedy because we have to do it. We have to fail. If we don't try and fail, then nothing will be there's no success. But if we recognize the failure and aren't able to accept that and live with it and adjust our systems and our thinking, that's a tragedy. Anything from that point on is a tragedy. And we have to be able to avoid that time lost because it may seem like the time before is a huge amount, but in reality, if we can make that time before like 80+%, 100, I'm going to guess 100% isn't so easy, but something like that versus that time before being maybe like 15 to 20% of the total time wasted. I mean, that adds up to months and years. That can add up to months and years of a life.
I just you mentioned it earlier about this whole philosophy and mentality that arose in really the last 50, 60 years of the end of history, right? That, yeah, no, we want to reach a point that then we're basically done. We figured it out, right? We don't need to be imposters anymore. We know what we're doing. And I won't point out, like you said, that's not been the case in human history, in biological history, arguably in cosmological history. It's always been presented with challenges because that's how we grow, by looking up new limits, and then you're there, and then new challenge is going to arise because it's a complex system. So your actions are going to create the new problems. And it's also one of the things now I thought about a lot. A couple of years ago, I launched a startup to address climate change, right? And we were very idealistic, and we had behavioral change. It was all about nudging. It was once to create a platform where people could basically track their, sustainability and change their behavior based on it. And I've gone so far from that now because the issue of climate change is, first of all, incredibly complex, right? It's like, it's being treated like science. It's climate change. Like, there's so many things, some very serious, some way less serious, like different regions are going to be affected very differently. It's a very complex issue. But the biggest thing that I am a little bit afraid of when I see it, the way some people, especially people that are gaining a lot of traction, a lot of popularity, are very afraid. And they're not seeing climate change as a challenge that we need to overcome. They see it as a threat that we need to run away from, in that sense, right? Like, throughout human history, we have done things to go forward, to develop ourselves, to make leaps, and then new challenges arise. Fossil fuels arguably were once a great innovation. We managed to do incredible things because we extracted more efficient energy from more efficient sources, and then we added to a new problem. But that doesn't mean now we just need to find new ways of fixing that problem and not running back. And a lot of the narrative now is about going back, right? About stopping what we're doing. And the people leading them, it's like they are afraid, one. And whenever you're in a crisis, you shouldn't follow the person who is like, showing signs of afraid. No, they're not going to make good decisions. They're going to run away, or they're going to, do crazy. They're not thinking straight. And then the second of all, they propose almost authoritarian solutions to go backwards. So it's not new innovations, it's not new solutions to new circumstances, a new world. No, it's going back to what we knew. It's going back to that certainty. Oh, if we just don't use fossil fuels, that's what worked. And that is very dangerous, right? We should look at the people who are very optimistic, who are calm, who say, like, hey, look, like, this is an issue. Yes, it is. You don't want people to say this is not real or whatever, but like, this is an issue. But let's focus on what is most important now. Let's do it in a reasonable way, and we're gonna fix it, right? We're gonna find out ways. We might not know it now, but we're gonna find out ways how to do it. And I think that's just the whole, like I said, like, just try things now, fail fast, don't shy away from it, don't be afraid. Just accept the uncertainty. Just don't try to manage and control everything. It's gonna be like challenges will come up and arise for us to evolve, for us to grow. That's from kids to society level to everything.
Yes. And, climate change is, unfortunately, it's a serious issue and we're seeing it. Everyone's climate is different this summer. I mean, I'm at least I know Europe, everyone's climate is different. North America, everyone's climate is different than it has been, 15 years ago. It was similar, but it's changed.
Yeah.
And so it's obvious something needs to be done, but we also have to recognize like these sort of issues can be used against us. People can take these sort of issues that we feel very deeply, very strongly about. I care about climate change. I don't want the world, I don't want myself, I don't want my family and friends to suffer from climate change. It's going to happen, and we need to mitigate it, combat it, find systems to be able to shield ourselves from it. But not letting that fear be manipulated or be drawn upon or be altered for someone else's, say maybe they have an agenda. Everyone's has an agenda, and maybe someone has an agenda, and that agenda would be assisted through something involving climate change, making sure that we understand what's going on. What's this system? Understanding it's complicated, talking to people, not taking one source of information and not taking maybe just two, but talking to people. And that's easier said than done because that's a lot of work. And some people don't like to take that work. But again, like I said earlier, in order for a democracy to work well, the populace needs to be engaged and deep thinkers. That's a responsibility. We take on the responsibility of living in a democracy. And when we do that, it's not just you let things ride it out and, what happens, happens. It's like, no, we took, maybe we're born into it, but if we love it, if we cherish it, then we have to foster it. And I really took that to heart, what you said. It's like deep thinkers, democracy. It's like that's very obvious, but it's hard today because with our phones, with computers, with television, we can be fed everything we need to know without with ease. It's actually much more difficult for us to avoid these systems of automated ingestion of news, of automated ingestion of other people's headlines, and then to be able to say, okay, I don't want to just take that in whenever, even though it's pretty impossible to never take it in anything, but then say, all right, I'm going to try and frame my system so that I'm open. I can understand new things as they come and, have that plasticity, that mind in our mind.
Yeah. Yeah. And especially the point we made earlier of don't accept that almost everything in life will involve trade-offs, that even something as important as climate change and dealing with it and mitigating it will have many possible ways, right? There will be an infinite amount of ways we can deal with it successfully. And there will be a lot of ways we could deal with it unsuccessfully. And it will all require trade-offs. There's no universal truth that will provide the perfect solution, which now we're claiming and we're saying, if we only do this, it's gonna be worth it, and take into account the costs and the trade-off. And that is very difficult to do, just to talk to each other and take people serious. That there's just this thing now in the Netherlands actually about Dutch farmers, and it's been a huge push to decrease farming because of it's very carbon intensive. But Dutch farmers are the most efficient on the planet in terms of farming, and they now are cutting them by 20 to 25%. And of course, we need to cut carbon emissions, and we need to find out, alternatives, and we need to do all that. but at what cost? You know, we're talking, especially with Ukraine and Russia, about a huge food crisis coming, and then now you're taking away 20% of the most efficient farms. So like, that's not where the problem lies, you know, that like those farms are already doing incredibly efficient. So they're using the least amount of carbon for the output they're producing. So why are we focusing on that, right? What are the costs to making all those people unemployed, to not having food, to later having to do something else that might be worse, right? Like if a food crisis comes, then we have to import food from other places that use more carbon emissions to create that output. And it's just kind of all about like just, we have to be very careful and deliberate and talk to people, hear from theirs, right? Like from different places, like, okay, what is acceptable to us as a society? What costs are acceptable to us as a society in its entirety? We can talk about that. We won't always agree, but we will find, you know, at one point an agreement there on what our direct priorities should be. And that requires engagement. And that I think it's this two-way street. I agree with you that it requires deep thinkers. That people need to be engaged, but it's also a two-way street, right? If we also need to allow people to be engaged. And it's kind of like we talked about earlier, that you can be critical unless it's critical about how we're doing things, or about the university, or about, you know, the scientific fields or whatever. Because then you will just isolate people. People won't engage with it anymore because there's no purpose in it, right? If you're saying the government, the state on a federal level will do everything, then why will people get involved on the local level if they don't get to decide, if they don't actually get to decide what happens to them? Why would people engage? And there's a lot of people who want to engage, I think, but we also need to allow that, right? Like by talking to them on a serious level, not just saying like, yeah, sure, you're not rational, or your solutions don't make any sense, we're not going to listen to you. I think there's a balance there to be struck between, you know, incentivizing people to join and also listening to them. And it was, I think, de Tocqueville, like a French socialist and political philosopher, who said, especially in the US, that take away political participation in America, and you take away 50% of their life. And that was in like the 1800s. That's a functioning democracy, because people were engaged on the local level in their town halls, in their schools, in their, you know, local governments, all the way up to the top. They were engaged and they were doing things that take that away. It's 50% of their life. So people care about it a lot. Take away politics today, maybe a couple of tweets, maybe going to vote once every 4 years. You don't take people's lives away. You know, people are not engaged to that extent. But I think it's because we don't allow a lot of people to have a say in their local governments. It's only up to that 1% that make it to, you know, state government that often get to engage in that kind of conversation. And I think that's changing. I think a lot of people are very adamant about these issues. But that's why from a educated point of view, from people in big cities, from people in government, we need to not just demand that people are engaged, we need to also allow that to happen, right? We need to, that if they want something different on a local level somewhere, let's say in Alabama, they want to do something that's very different and considered not okay in New York, let them. If that's what they want there, and they have deliberated that, then who are we to go in and say, no, this is wrong, this is not rational, even though 90% of people want that there? Then of course they're not going to engage in politics. Of course they at one point just going to, you know, isolate. Of course at one point they're going to radicalize to a Donald Trump who says, screw this, nothing is right. So in that sense, well, right, there's also responsibility on deep thinkers, but there's also responsibility at a societal level to, and almost elitist level, right, to allow that to happen, to allow those people to disagree with you, engage in those conversations, listen to them. You know, people aren't stupid, listen to them. And allow them to make their own decisions. I think that's responsibility on both sides in that sense.
My guest today has been Daniel Gwellen. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks so much, Karush. This was fun.